The morning sun painted golden streaks across the San Francisco International Airport as passengers hurried through security checkpoints and rushed to their gates. Among them was a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly pressed navy blue suit, pulling a sleek carry-on suitcase. Her confident stride and subtle smile gave no hint of the storm brewing behind her composed exterior. As she waited in the priority boarding line for United Airlines Flight 892 to New York, she scrolled through her phone one last time, double-checking the details of her new apartment in Manhattan. The job offer from the startup had seemed like perfect timing. A fresh start, a bigger salary, and most importantly, a chance to leave everything behind. Now boarding business class passengers, the gate agent announced, her voice echoing through the terminal. The woman handed over her boarding pass, accepting the agent's routine "have a nice flight" with a polite nod. As she walked down the jet bridge, her heels clicked against the floor in a steady rhythm, each step taking her closer to what she believed would be her new life. The Boeing 787 welcomed her with that familiar smell of fresh air and leather seats. She found her spot in 4A, a window seat with extra legroom. Perfect for the 6-hour journey ahead. A flight attendant offered her a pre-takeoff drink, and she chose sparkling water with lemon, her usual flight ritual. What she didn't know was that in a secure office building thousands of miles away, a team of FBI cybercrime analysts was watching her every digital move. Her boarding pass scan had triggered a silent alert in their system, confirming what they had suspected for weeks: she was making her move. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, she gazed out at the morning fog rolling over the San Francisco Bay. The mountains peeped through the mist like distant guardians, unknowing witnesses to what would soon unfold. She had always loved this view, having taken countless business trips during her 10 years in tech. But this time felt different. This time, she was leaving for good. The massive engines roared to life, pushing the aircraft forward with unstoppable force. As the plane lifted off the ground, she felt that familiar flutter in her stomach, part excitement, part anxiety. The city below grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. At that moment, suspended between earth and sky, she allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking she had made it. Other passengers settled into their routines, some dozed off, others opened laptops or tablets, and a few began watching movies on their seatback screens. The woman pulled out her own laptop, a high-end model with encrypted drives and secure communication software. She had been careful, incredibly careful. Every transaction had been bounced through multiple servers, every communication carefully coded, every digital footprint supposedly erased. The flight attendants began their first service round as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. The gentle hum of the engines created a peaceful backdrop as passengers were served their choice of breakfast. She opted for coffee and a croissant, maintaining her usual business traveler persona. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, sitting in business class, being served breakfast at $800 per seat, while carrying the access codes to millions in stolen corporate funds. The startup job offer was real enough, but it was just a cover for the real plan. A plan that had taken 18 months to execute, involving offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transfers, and a web of digital deception that she believed was impossible to trace. Little did she know that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble, and her journey would end very differently from what she had planned. The clear blue sky outside her window held no hint of the approaching storm, and as the plane continued its eastward journey, the countdown to her shocking mid-flight fate had already begun. 2 hours into the flight, the steady hum of the engines had lulled many passengers into a peaceful sleep. The woman in 4 opened her laptop, its soft blue light illuminating her face in the dimmed cabin. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she began what appeared to be routine work preparation for her new job. Meanwhile, in a bustling office building in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The cybercrime unit of the FBI had transformed into a hive of focused activity. Analysts huddled around multiple screens, tracking what seemed like an endless stream of data. Coffee cups littered the desks, evidence of their overnight surveillance operation. "Look at this pattern." One analyst pointed to a series of transactions on his screen. The numbers told a story that had taken months to piece together. What started as a routine corporate audit had unveiled a sophisticated scheme that would make even veteran investigators raise their eyebrows. The transactions were like pieces of a digital puzzle, each one small enough to avoid immediate detection, but together they painted a picture of one of the most elegant corporate heists they'd seen. Back on the plane, the woman took a sip of water, unaware that her every digital move was being monitored. She opened what looked like a normal spreadsheet, but hidden within its seemingly innocent rows and columns lay the key to understanding her elaborate plan. The file contained carefully coded references to cryptocurrency wallets and offshore accounts, disguised as ordinary business projections. The investigation team had spent countless hours tracking her digital footprints. They discovered how she had built her scheme layer by layer, like an architect designing an invisible building. First came the small transfers, test runs to see if anyone would notice. Then larger movements, always timed with legitimate business activities to avoid suspicion. She had used the latest encryption technology and bounced her signals through servers across the globe, from Singapore to Switzerland. At 30,000 feet, she reviewed what she thought was her masterpiece. The woman had orchestrated everything to look like routine corporate restructuring. Money flowed through a maze of accounts, each transfer disguised as legitimate business expenses. She had even created fake vendor contracts and service agreements to justify the movements. To an untrained eye, it all looked perfectly normal. But she had made one crucial mistake. In the world of digital crime, it's often the smallest detail that unravels the entire scheme. In this case, it was a pattern in her internet usage, a seemingly insignificant digital signature that appeared every time she accessed certain accounts. It was like leaving a fingerprint at a crime scene, except this fingerprint was made of data. The FBI team had been building their case methodically, gathering evidence piece by piece. They had traced connections between apparently unrelated accounts, decoded encrypted messages, and mapped out a complex web of financial transactions. What emerged was a picture of a crime that spanned continents and involved millions of dollars. As the plane continued its journey eastward, the woman closed one program and opened another. Each click, each keystroke was now being logged and analyzed in real time. The irony was that she thought she was checking on her success, but she was actually confirming what the investigators already knew. In Washington, the team leader looked at the final pieces of evidence falling into place. They had everything they needed: the transaction records, the communication logs, the money trails. What made this case unique wasn't just the amount of money involved, but the intelligence behind it. This wasn't a smash-and-grab job. It was more like a digital ballet, choreographed over months with precision and skill. The woman gazed out of her window at the endless expanse of clouds below, feeling a sense of accomplishment. In her mind, she had pulled off the perfect crime. She didn't realize that 30,000 feet below, a team of dedicated professionals had already unraveled her entire scheme, and the next phase of their operation was about to begin. Looking back, there had been signs, small moments that should have made her pause, tiny red flags that now seemed to wave frantically in her memory as she sat in her business class seat. The woman reached for her water bottle, and her hand trembled slightly as memories of the past few months flooded back. It had started 3 months ago with that unexpected audit. She remembered walking into the office that Monday morning to find the corporate security team already there, their presence marked by visitor badges and serious expressions. Just a routine check, they'd said, but their eyes told a different story as they combed through digital records and server logs. The memory of her assistant's face clouded her thoughts. The young woman had appeared at her office door one evening, clutching a tablet with trembling hands. "I found something strange in the server logs," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Some of the backup files from last quarter. They're just gone." The woman had dismissed her concerns with a wave of her hand and a confident smile. "Technical glitch," she'd said. "Nothing to worry about." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she recalled the meeting with legal counsel 6 weeks ago. The corporate lawyer, a man who'd been with the company for 20 years, had called her into his office. His reading glasses had sat unused on his desk as he studied her face. "We're seeing some unusual patterns in our international transactions," he'd said carefully, watching her reaction. "Anything you think we should know about?" The woman had maintained her composure, explaining away the anomalies with well-practiced answers about new market expansion and digital transformation initiatives. Her voice hadn't wavered, her expressions had remained neutral, and she even suggested improvements to their compliance procedures. The lawyer had nodded, seemingly satisfied, but she'd noticed how he'd written something in his notebook after she left. There had been other moments too. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the break room, the 8 team's sudden interest in upgrading security protocols, the risk management director's impromptu visits to her department. At the time, she'd seen these as separate, unconnected events. Now, as the plane cruised over the Midwest, they aligned like stars forming a constellation of warning. A particularly telling moment had come during the last board meeting. The CFO had presented a routine financial report, but his laser pointer had lingered a fraction too long on certain transaction lines. She'd noticed the board members exchanging glances, their faces masked with practiced neutrality. The questions that followed had seemed innocent enough, but now she recognized their careful precision, like skilled surgeons probing for something hidden. The woman closed her eyes, remembering the email she'd received just last week. It had come from the company's cybersecurity team, a bland announcement about system updates and server maintenance. But buried in the technical jargon was a single line that had made her heart skip. "All historical access logs will be preserved during the upgrade process." She deleted the email immediately, but its words had burned into her memory. Perhaps the most unsettling sign had been the change in her own behavior. She'd started taking different routes to work, varying her routine in small ways. Her online shopping habits had shifted, more business attire, less personal items. She'd withdrawn from office social events, claiming deadlines and projects. Even her lunch habits had changed, preferring takeout at her desk to the usual gatherings with colleagues. The woman opened her eyes and stared at her reflection in the airplane window. The setting sun cast a golden glow across her face, but she noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw. She told herself these changes were natural, part of preparing for a new job in a new city. But deep down, she'd known. Every declined lunch invitation, every late-night office visit, every carefully worded email, they were all breadcrumbs leading to this moment. As the flight attendant passed by with the beverage cart, the woman checked her phone again, a habit she developed over the past months. No new messages, no unexpected alerts. Everything seemed normal, just as she'd planned. But then again, everything had seemed normal all along, even as the pieces of her carefully constructed world had begun to slip away, one warning sign at a time. The dinner service was in full swing when everything began to change. The smell of warm bread and heated meals filled the cabin as flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles with their carts. The woman in 4A had just unfolded her tray table when she noticed something odd, a subtle shift in the cabin crew's behavior. It started with quick glances. The lead flight attendant kept checking her phone, something she hadn't done during the first half of the flight. 2 other crew members huddled near the galley, their whispered conversation just barely audible over the hum of the engines. Their usual practiced smiles seemed slightly strained, their movements a touch more hurried than before. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual update about weather and arrival time. "Cabin crew, please report to the forward galley." His tone was casual, but something about it made the woman's skin prickle. She'd been on hundreds of flights, and this wasn't normal procedure during meal service. Through the gap between seats, she watched as the flight attendants gathered near the cockpit. Their faces were serious as they listened to something on a crew phone. One of them kept glancing back down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin in a way that seemed too deliberate to be routine. The woman pulled out her own phone, checking it for the 100th time. Still no signal at this altitude, of course. But now this familiar action brought a new wave of anxiety. She thought about all the digital tracks she'd left behind. Each swipe, each click, each transaction. Had she really covered them all? A flight attendant approached with a dinner cart. Chicken or pasta? She asked, her smile professional, but her eyes not quite meeting the woman's gaze. The woman chose the chicken, more out of habit than hunger. As the attendant placed the tray on her table, she noticed the crew member's hand trembling slightly. The cabin fell into an unusual quiet as passengers ate their meals. Even the usual chatter of travelers had dimmed, as if everyone could sense the growing tension in the air. The woman pushed her food around the plate, her appetite gone. The chicken she'd been looking forward to now tasted like cardboard in her mouth. Through her window, she could see they were flying over a blanket of clouds, the last rays of sunlight painting them in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere below was America's heartland, endless fields and small towns passing by unaware of the drama unfolding above them. She checked her watch. Still 2 hours to New York. 2 hours to figure out why everything felt wrong. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time addressing the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a mechanical issue, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Chicago. Please remain calm. This is purely precautionary. His words were measured, practiced, but the woman knew instantly that this was a lie. She watched as passengers exchanged confused looks and concerned murmurs spread through the cabin. A young mother across the aisle hugged her child closer. A businessman in a suit 2 rows ahead closed his laptop with an annoyed sigh. They all thought this was just an inconvenience, a delay in their travel plans. But the woman knew better. Her heart began to race as she noticed movement near the back of the plane. 2 passengers she hadn't paid attention to before were now sitting up straighter, more alert. Their casual clothes and relaxed demeanors from earlier had transformed into something more purposeful. Air marshals. They had been watching the whole time. She forced herself to breathe slowly to maintain her composure. The flight attendants were collecting dinner trays with practiced efficiency, but their movements seemed mechanical now, their smiles frozen in place. The plane had started its descent, and through the window, she could see the bright lights of Chicago appearing through breaks in the clouds. Her fingers gripped the armrest as reality set in. This wasn't a mechanical issue. This wasn't a routine landing. This was the moment everything would change. 4 hours ago, she had boarded this flight believing she was heading toward freedom. Now, as the plane banked toward O'Hare International Airport, she realized she was flying straight into a trap of her own making. The descent into Chicago felt like the longest 20 minutes of her life. As the plane dropped through layers of clouds, the woman watched the city lights grow larger, each glowing dot below becoming streets, buildings, and highways. The sight that usually brought her comfort now filled her with dread. Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your tray tables are stowed, the lead flight attendant announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor that only someone listening for trouble would notice. The usual shuffle of passengers preparing for landing had an added edge of tension, though most remained unaware of what was really happening. The woman could feel the air marshal's presence behind her now, their energy different from regular passengers. She didn't dare turn around, but she knew they were watching, waiting. Their earlier casual poses had transformed into alert readiness. One of them coughed, a signal, perhaps. Through the window, she could see the familiar layout of O'Hare International Airport coming into view. The parallel runways stretched out like glowing ribbons in the evening darkness. But something was different. Even from this height, she could make out unusual activity on the ground. More vehicles than normal gathered near one of the terminals. Her hands were ice cold as she gripped the armrests. The businessman next to her offered a sympathetic smile, mistaking her tension for fear of flying. "Don't worry," he said kindly. "These unscheduled stops happen all the time. Probably just being extra careful about something minor." She managed a weak nod, knowing he had no idea how wrong he was. The plane banked left, then right, lining up with the runway. The landing gear dropped with a thud that made several passengers jump. A young couple across the aisle held hands, the woman resting her head on her partner's shoulder. A child a few rows back asked loudly, "Are we there yet?" Normal moments in what was about to become a very abnormal situation. The woman's mind raced through her options, though she knew there weren't many. She was trapped in a metal tube, surrounded by innocent people, with trained officers just feet away. Her carefully planned escape was crumbling around her, and all she could do was sit and wait for the inevitable. The flight attendants had taken their seats, but their usual calm demeanor had slipped. They kept exchanging glances, their knuckles white as they gripped the jump seat handles. The woman wondered if they knew what was about to happen, if they had been briefed about the real reason for this landing. As they descended through the last layer of clouds, raindrops began hitting the windows. The plane emerged into the misty Chicago evening, the city's lights blurred by the weather. The captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Flight crew, prepare for arrival." His words carried a weight that seemed to press her deeper into her seat. She could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their lights off for now. To any other passenger, they might have looked like routine ground crew vehicles. But she recognized the subtle differences in their shapes. These weren't maintenance trucks. They were law enforcement. The wheels touched down with a screech, and the engines roared in reverse. As the plane slowed, she noticed more details through her rain-streaked window. Multiple dark vehicles were approaching the runway, keeping pace with the aircraft as it taxied. This wasn't going to be a quick stop for mechanical issues. The plane turned off the main runway, but instead of heading toward a terminal, it moved toward a remote area of the airport. Most passengers were too busy checking their phones, now that they could, to notice this unusual routing. But the woman knew. This was standard procedure for high-risk situations. They were taking no chances. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, she took one last look at her phone. No messages, no calls, no last-minute warnings from her contacts. The screen reflected her face, and for a moment, she hardly recognized herself. The confident executive was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired, afraid, and very, very alone. In the distance, she could see more vehicles approaching, their lights still dark. The next few minutes would change everything, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The plane had barely come to a complete stop when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The usual post-flight rustling of passengers reaching for bags and phones fell silent at his unusually stern tone. Through the rain-spotted window, emergency lights suddenly flared to life, bathing the wet tarmac in rotating red and blue. The woman's heart pounded so hard, she was sure the passengers around her could hear it. The businessman next to her pressed his face against his window, curiosity overcoming courtesy. "What in the world?" he muttered. The cabin door opened with a distinctive whoosh, but instead of ground crew members, dark-suited figures appeared in the doorway. Their movements were precise, practiced, professional. The lead flight attendant's voice shook slightly as she made an unprecedented announcement. "All passengers, please place your hands on the seat in front of you where they can be seen." Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers slowly complied. A child started crying somewhere in the back, quickly hushed by a worried parent. The woman placed her trembling hands on the seat ahead, her perfectly manicured nails now seeming like artifacts from another life. The federal agents moved down the aisle with measured steps. Their shoes made soft thuds on the carpet. Thud, 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 like a countdown to the inevitable. The woman kept her eyes forward, but she could feel them getting closer. A flight attendant was quietly crying now, the professional mask finally cracking under the strain. "Ma'am," a firm voice stood beside her. She looked up to see a female agent, her badge gleaming under the cabin lights. "Please stand up slowly and step into the aisle." The businessman next to her pressed himself against his window, eyes wide with shock as he realized his seatmate was the target. Her legs felt like lead as she stood. The cabin had gone completely silent except for the hum of the idle engines and the patter of rain against the windows. 200 pairs of eyes watched as she stepped into the aisle. Phones appeared from nowhere, their cameras capturing the moment despite the crew's protests. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the agent instructed. The woman complied, her designer jacket pulling tight across her shoulders. The cold click of handcuffs echoed through the silent cabin. Someone gasped. The young mother across the aisle covered her child's eyes. "You are under arrest," the agent began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin. "You have the right to remain silent." The familiar words from countless TV shows and movies now became her reality. Each right read out was another nail in the coffin of her freedom. A young tech worker in the front row whispered loudly to his seatmate. I knew she looked familiar. "She's that executive from," but was quickly shushed by a stern-looking air marshal. The woman kept her eyes down, not wanting to see the looks on people's faces as they put the pieces together. The walk of shame began. Step by step, she was led toward the front of the plane. Every inch felt like a mile. She passed the first-class cabin where a famous actor sat slack-jawed, his expensive whiskey forgotten. Past the galley where the flight attendants huddled together, their eyes a mixture of fear and fascination. Past the cockpit where the captain stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. At the plane's door, the rain hit her face, mixing with a single tear she couldn't hold back. Below, a group of FBI agents waited on the wet tarmac, their black SUVs forming a perimeter around the aircraft. News vans were already visible at the airport's fence line, their satellite dishes reaching up into the rainy night sky. As she was led down the stairs, her high heels no longer clicking with confidence, but shuffling awkwardly in restraints, she caught her reflection in the plane's wet surface. The woman who had boarded in San Francisco wasn't the same one descending these stairs. That woman had been confident, poised, thinking she was above the law. This woman was human, fallible, and caught, her masterpiece of deception unraveled at 30,000 feet. The news broke like a thunderclap across the digital world. Within hours of the dramatic airport arrest, every major news outlet was running the story. "High-tech heist ends at 30,000 feet," screamed one headline. "Corporate executives' mile-high fall from grace," declared another. The videos taken by passengers had already gone viral, with millions of views across social media platforms. In the stark fluorescent light of the FBI's Chicago field office, the true scope of the scheme began to emerge. The numbers were staggering. $43 million moved through a maze of international accounts. The investigation team laid out their evidence across multiple screens: transaction logs, encrypted messages, digital breadcrumbs that had taken months to collect. Back at the company's headquarters, employees gathered in stunned groups around their computer screens, watching the news unfold. The young assistant who had first noticed the missing server logs sat at her desk, hands shaking as she realized the magnitude of what she had stumbled upon. The corporate lawyer who had questioned the unusual transactions months ago closed his office door, spending hours on the phone with federal prosecutors. The story captivated the public's imagination. Here was someone who had seemed to have it all: the prestigious job, the corner office, the respect of her peers. People couldn't stop talking about how she had managed to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme while maintaining a perfect professional facade. Morning shows debated the psychology behind white-collar crime, while tech blogs dissected the digital forensics that led to her capture. In Silicon Valley's expensive coffee shops and corporate campuses, the conversations turned introspective. Young executives checked their moral compasses, wondering if they too could be tempted by the promise of easy millions. Corporate security teams worldwide began reviewing their protocols, searching for similar patterns in their own systems. The passenger manifest from Flight 892 became a hot commodity among journalists. The businessman who had sat next to her gave interview after interview, describing every detail of the flight. She seemed so normal. He kept saying, "Just another business traveler." The flight attendants were interviewed too, their story of maintaining composure during the arrest adding another layer to the unfolding drama. Inside the Federal Detention Center, the former executive faced a different reality. Gone were the designer suits and corporate meetings, replaced by orange jumpsuits and interrogation rooms. Federal prosecutors built their case methodically, each piece of evidence revealing new layers of the scheme. The investigation expanded, uncovering connections to underground crypto exchanges and shadow banking networks. The company held emergency board meetings to address the crisis. Shareholders demanded answers, stock prices fluctuated, and PR teams worked overtime to maintain confidence in the firm's security protocols. The incident sparked a broader conversation about corporate oversight and digital security in the modern age. The rain-soaked arrest on that Chicago tarmac had lasting ripples. Airlines updated their procedures for handling law enforcement interventions. Corporate security firms used the case as a training example. Tech companies strengthened their financial monitoring systems, determined not to fall victim to similar schemes. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the human level. The young professionals who had once admired her success now saw a cautionary tale. In break rooms and online forums, people shared their own experiences of witnessing workplace red flags, of moments when they chose integrity over opportunity. The story even made its way into business school curricula, becoming a case study in ethics and corporate responsibility. Students debated the warning signs, the motivations, and the cultural factors that could drive a successful executive to risk everything for ill-gotten gains. In the end, it wasn't just a story about money or crime. It was a story about choices, about the thin line between ambition and greed, about how the digital age had created new opportunities for both innovation and deception. The woman's dramatic arrest at 30,000 feet became more than just a sensational headline. It became a turning point in how the corporate world viewed itself and its vulnerabilities. As the case moved toward trial, the videos of that rainy night in Chicago continued to circulate. Each view served as a reminder that in an age of digital fingerprints and connected systems, no scheme, no matter how clever, could stay hidden forever. The truth, like that fateful flight, would eventually have to land.